Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to a special time slot of Lunch for the Scientist. My name is Leah with Headwaters Science Institute, and once again, I am really proud to introduce yet another STEM professional who is going to give you some insight into her career today. We are very excited to have Monaliza Noor, who I'll tell you about in just a little bit. But first, I want to start off by talking about what today is for us. It's a very special day. It's Giving Tuesday, if you haven't already heard of it. It's a big day to support nonprofits in your local community. And for us, this is really important because, as we all know, education has looked kind of different this year, and we've really fought to navigate what that looks like. So this year alone, we created over 100 free online lessons for students, which do utilize some digital delivery, but aim to get the students off the screen and really doing things hands-on outside. We've also created some high-level research programs, and we're aiming to raise more money to continue our scholarships for those programs for next year. So today is a big day for us. If you are able to give a donation, it would really help our students access hands-on learning next year. So we are participating in Give Back Tahoe. There's a grant challenge going on right now where if Headwaters can pull in the most amount of donors today, we will also win $2,500 in extra grant money to create scholarships. So we would love to have your help. Any donation of even just $5 makes a difference for us. So as you can see here in this photo, you can text to give by texting the word Headwaters to this phone number, or you can visit the short link here and it'll take you to our Give Back Tahoe page. To everyone who's donated so far, we really appreciate it. And to all of you watching, thank you so much for your continued support. Even if it was just a like or a share of one of our posts, everything that you've done has made a huge difference. So now to get to the exciting part of the day, I'm about to welcome Monaliza Noor. She is going to be the second speaker in our series of waste management professionals, which pairs with a brand new waste management curriculum that we just put out, as well as a composting video that you can find on our website. So all of this is one big unit, learning about different facets of waste management. And Monaliza in particular is an Associate Analyst at HF&H Consultants. And there she helps local governments procure long-term solid waste and recycling contracts. Her specialty is in making sure those contracts are compliant with SB 1383, which is a new state law that's going to be implemented in 2022. And it requires most Californians to recycle their organic waste. So a big deal for us Californians, something we're very excited about. She also conducts hauler performance reviews, contract analysis, and assists in the development of zero waste planning reports. So she has a degree in environmental management from the University of San Francisco, as well as a master's. And her background is in politics and sociology, with her bachelor's degree coming from UC Santa Cruz. And we are very excited to welcome Monaliza Noor. Hi, how are you?
Good, thank you. I'm really excited to be here. I will go ahead and launch into my presentation.
Yes, absolutely.
Right?
We'll take you.
Okay, here we go. Introduction. I'm going to first just tell you a little bit more about my background and what I do. So my professional background is actually in journalism, but about 5 years ago, I shifted and went into the environmental field, got a master's degree in environmental management, and then I went into the solid waste industry. And so specifically, I do work for a consulting firm, and we only work with local governments, and we help them do a few things. You know, it's an interesting, solid waste management is an interesting entity in the public sphere. You know, city governments are responsible for securing those contracts and making sure that your trash gets picked up every week. But the companies that are actually providing that service, like a waste management or a recology, those are private companies. And so we help broker the deals, those long-term agreements that Leah mentioned. We help make sure that the haulers, what they're asking for is valid. We represent the ratepayers in the cities, and so we want to make sure that what you're paying for, you you get the most out of it. So that's just a little bit of background on our firm. We're going to talk about SB 1383, which is a new law, and it's really a game changer in the solid waste world. But first off, what you see on your screen now in the presentation is an agenda of what we're going to be covering today. So first, I'm going to start off with a little history on trash and recycling. We're going to go talk about a tale of two streams. And when I talk about streams, I'm really talking about, you can think of them as categories or buckets of materials. So we'll start with the two main streams that people usually think about, trash and recycling. And then there were three streams. We're going to talk about organic materials. And we'll talk about different collection systems and regulations and how different cities collect and process their organic materials and why that matters. Then we're going to talk about 1383, SB 1383. It's a very big deal. I spend most of my job making sure that these contracts are compliant with all of the regulations. There are 127 pages of regulations with 1383. Then we're going to bring it back, hopefully, and talk about the big picture and talk about climate change. This presentation is trash, recycling, and climate change. So I am going to do my best to connect the dots a little bit and, keep the big picture in mind. So with that, I'm going to jump in. So first, we are talking about a tale of two streams. First off, let's talk about trash. So before 1965, how was trash regulated? Or, well, trash wasn't regulated before 1965, I should say. What did we do to our trash? Well, there was open dumping. Essentially, there was just a pit in the ground and people would throw whatever that they wanted there, their discarded materials, but there was no type of making sure that there were public health measures in place to make sure, for instance, toxic materials were not leaking into a nearby waterway. So that was one method. Another method for organic materials was hog feed. We would give our food scraps to the hogs and they would eat it. Actually, not a bad idea. That's kind of coming back nowadays. Another method was incineration, just burning it. But of course, that could emit toxic chemicals into the air if they're not regulated. Another way of getting rid of our stuff was the garbage disposal, getting rid of our food scraps and leftovers. And then there is the sanitary landfill, which it's kind of similar to an open dump. The main difference is the sanitary landfill does have the precautions in place to make sure there isn't any leaking, that toxic chemicals are kind of kept apart. So what about the regulations? So I mentioned 1965. So what happened in 1965? Pretty much Congress realized that they needed to have some laws. They needed to have something on the books that would regulate all of this waste that was coming out from generators. So they passed the Solid Waste Disposal Act in 1965, and this was kind of fun. I like going back. This comes from my background in journalism. I like to go back to source material as much as I can, and so this was kind of fun to dig up the actual language that was used for this. And so a part of their findings and their purposes, I like number 4 and 5 that I added in here. The reason why they needed to have this law was that there was an inefficient and improper methods of disposal of solid waste that resulted in scenic blights that created serious hazards to public health, including pollution of air and water resources, accident hazards, and increase in rodent and insect vectors of disease, having an adverse effect on land values and creating public nuisances. The Congress also realized that the failure or inability to salvage and reuse materials economically resulted in the unnecessary waste and depletion of our natural resources. So that's the mindset that they were thinking of. However, 1965, they enacted this act, but it wasn't enough. So in 1976, about 11 years later, they amended the Solid Waste Disposal Act, and they realized that more had to be done specifically with hazardous materials. We weren't tracking those hazardous materials as closely as we should have. So in 1976, they do the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act amendment. In the industry, it's called RCRA, RCRA or RCRA. And so what RCRA did, there were a few kind of main national goals: protect human health and the environment from potential hazards of waste disposal, conserve energy and natural resources, reduce the amount of waste that's generated, and ensure that waste are managed in an environmentally sound manner. Okay, so that's the trash side. So let's go back now and talk about recycling. So some form of recycling has been going on for a very long time. I found this picture from 1892 of rag pickers in Paris. You know, I think intrinsically we've always wanted to reuse things and not waste them. It's kind of a natural component, although some could say we've gotten away from that. So that, you know, some form has been happening for a long time. In the 1940s, there was a push for recycling for the war effort, for people to recycle their waste papers, their rags, their metals, and their rubber. And then in 1962, you know, in the early 60s was very a pivotal moment for the environmental movement. And in 1962, Rachel Carson came out with her book, Silent Spring, which was a huge turning point. It shined a light on the use of DDT, a chemical, and those impacts that it might have to the natural world. And the antlers really started to go up. I mean, that 1962, 1963, just 1 year later, was when the Clean Air Act was passed, which is one of the huge pillars of environmental law. So then 1962 comes around. Are there any regulations? We're all more aware of the environment and what we're doing to it. Well, there's still no federal laws mandating that people have to recycle their recyclable materials. However, California, as California often has done in the environmental movement, led the way. And in 1989, they passed the Integrated Waste Management Act, AB 939. And this put the onus on jurisdictions to divert 25% of all of their solid waste from landfills by 1995, when this first came out, and then again divert by 50% by 2000. Now, this law didn't prescribe exactly how cities and jurisdictions had to do it. They just had to divert it. Diversion was the name of the game. And by diversion, we mean materials that are going to the landfill, you're diverting some of them, you're taking them away, those recyclable materials, we want to save them. So that was a really big deal in the solid waste industry, AB 939. But then in 2012, California passed another big recycling law, AB 341, which is mandatory commercial recycling. So then this law actually had a policy goal for the state not to a legislative declaration, not less than 75% of the solid waste generated should be reduced, recycled, composted by the year 2020. So it set this 75% standard. And in doing so, it also required certain businesses, based off of how much material they're generating, to have recycling service. So now, commercial, I have an asterisk there. In the world of regulations and contracts, defined terms are very important, you know. And so commercial in this context, and we see it throughout solid waste regulations actually, typically includes multifamily buildings with 5 or more units. So it's not only just your business, it's your 100-unit apartment building also falls under that. They are now required to have recycling service. Okay, so we talked about trash. We talked about recycling. Let's go back out and let's talk a little bit about our third stream, organics. Well, what are organics, first of all? I like to think of them as just anything that was once alive. Now, I mentioned how definitions are extremely important in regulatory compliance and in contracts. And so I've pasted below this definition from SB 1383, which is quite significant because this definition now really broadens how we look at organic materials and organic waste. Typically in the solid waste world, we've thought about organic materials as your food scraps in your yard trimmings, landscape pruning, leaves, flowers that are dead. But this definition kind of broadened it a little bit more. It includes organic textiles and carpets, lumber, wood, paper products, printing, and writing paper, which is actually a very, very big deal in the solid waste world because paper and printing and writing paper has typically been categorized as recyclable materials. It goes in what you would think is your recyclable container. However, this definition is really bundling it because paper is an organic material, and the whole point of separating this stuff is to mitigate methane emissions that come from the organic material. It is now encompassing paper products in the organic material definition. Okay, so how about any regulations? Are there any regulations? Well, again, there are no federal laws like recycling that say everyone has to recycle their organic waste. But again, California leading the charge, as it often does, in 2014 passed the mandatory commercial organics recycling law and AB 1826. Again, I've got the asterisk there, again, because commercial includes multifamily properties with 5 or more units. And there's even one more nuance in this law, and that is that multifamily properties don't have to worry about their food scraps. They just have to worry about their yard trimmings. Anyways, a nuance. So we've got AB 1826 that is targeting those commercial multifamily generators, but 1383 is coming, mandatory organics recycling for everyone. So we're going to talk about that. We've got our own section, but that law was passed in 2016 by Governor Brown, and we're going to get into it, but essentially it's going to require organics recycling for everyone. Now, of course, some exceptions do apply there, but most everyone, the name of the game is get everyone to recycle their organic waste. And what about city laws? So our city is requiring even before, so 1383 is going to be implemented in 2022. That's when it becomes effective. But you know, cities in the Bay Area and California, other places, they are already requiring their residents and their businesses to separate their organic material. So let's now look at a couple of those examples. So now we're going to go into that third bucket there of collection systems. So probably the most famous example, pioneering example, the city and county of San Francisco. They are coming up on, it's been 20 years since they launched their mandatory organics and mandatory recycling program. They were the first major city to do it. Actually, 1383, a lot of the state requirements, you can tell, come from examples like the city and county of San Francisco, like Alameda County. I mean, one glaring example is just those 3 containers that you see there with the blue, the green, and the black. 1383 brings with it color container requirements. And so they're actually modeled after San Francisco's system. So San Francisco is a city, as an example of how a local government can, while there are no state regulations, a local government can say, no, we understand the connection between climate change and organic waste and proper source separation and resource conservation. And we want to make our residents separate their materials and pay for it and process it. So San Francisco does it, but there are a whole bunch of different types of collection systems, right? I've got an example here of the city of San Jose's commercial collection system. And what they do is really interesting. They have a 2-container system where all of the wet or organic materials, all your food scraps, all your yard trimmings go into one container. And then in the other container is everything else, what they call the dry container. So your trash and your recyclables. But then what happens to that? So they still want to process that. There's a lot of good recyclable material in that dry bin. So they'll take that to a processing facility. They take it to Newbie Island and they process it. They take out all the recyclable materials. And then on the organic side, they probably have a cleaner product because it's just the organics in that one container. So this is an example of how different cities use different systems, and specifically within the city, this is a commercial collection system. So only businesses have this option. And then sometimes in other places, they have separate or different types of systems for their residential sector. An example of that is the city of Sunnyvale. For their residential collection, for their single family homes, they have 3 different carts, as you see there, but they have 5 different streams because 2 of their carts are split carts. So the green container on the left is for their yard trimmings. And then they have that middle black split container where on the left side of the container is the trash and on the yellow right side is the food scraps. And then the 3rd container is for their recyclables, but it's split into 2 again. So they have actually their paper, clean paper products on the left, and their containers, their metal, their aluminum, their cans on the right. Typically what we've seen, what the data shows is that when you have greater source separation at the source, like City of Sunnyvale with their 5 streams, you're gonna maintain a higher quality, less contamination if people are sorting their stuff properly, which is the goal. So those were just some examples of what cities are doing on their own. They're not required to do it by the state, but they recognize that they want to conserve this material and that they want to, mitigate their emissions. Okay, so we've talked about trash and recycling. We've talked about organics, collection systems. So now let's go talk about 1383, what's on my mind most days. So 1383 was passed in 2016, and it targets short-lived, very big picture, high level. This is what the legislative text says. This was the order. They wanted to target short-lived climate pollutants, mainly black carbon, methane, hydrofluorocarbon gases. They wanted to reduce them by these numbers, 50%, 40, 40, by 2030. So what are short-lived climate pollutants? This is the definition from the California Air Resource Board. They're powerful climate forcers that have relatively short atmospheric lifetimes. So they are especially strong over the short term. Now what that means is that if you target them because they are so strong over a short amount of time, you can get a little more bang for your buck because you're going after these really powerful greenhouse gases. So that feeds. So short-lived climate pollutants are greenhouse gases. Greenhouse gases are gases that trap heat in the atmosphere. If I was live and in a classroom, I would ask someone to tell me about the greenhouse effect, but I've got this little diagram here. And this is, again, keeping that big picture in mind, like what is the point of all of this, And I like to ask myself that again and again and keep the big picture in mind. But essentially, so these short-lived climate pollutants are greenhouse gases. We need greenhouse gases generally. Without them, our atmosphere wouldn't be livable. However, the issue with climate change and greenhouse gases, as many of you may know, is the rapid acceleration of our greenhouse gases over the last 150 years. And so, but what this diagram really shows is the impact that those greenhouse gases have. So we've got the sun's radiation coming towards the earth, about half of it's reflected out. And then some that's also comes and it gets absorbed by the earth. However, with the greenhouse gas accumulation there, they trap the heat. And so that heat that would have naturally gone out gets trapped. And that's why we have a warmer climate. That's why we have glaciers that are melting. That's why we have sea level rise and other factors that come from climate change. So going back here, so we've got these three different climate pollutants, greenhouse gases that 1383 is tackling. In the solid waste world, methane, okay. Well, before I go there, let's talk about what makeup in the big pie of our greenhouse gases, what makeup do those super pollutants make? Just for some context, when we talk about our greenhouse gas emissions as a country. And in 2018, carbon dioxide is the main player. I think many of us know that. Carbon dioxide coming from the production, the generation of heat and electricity, coming from transportation, from tailpipes, land use, other factors. But those super pollutants, you'll see methane is making up about 10%. The gases are 3%. Black carbon is not on here. It's probably smaller, but you're still getting a lot of bang for your buck if you try to mitigate it. So what is the tie between organic materials and methane? Well, this kind of captures it here. So that when we put organic materials in a landfill, they emit methane. And so, which is about 80 times greater than carbon dioxide. And so that's why we want to get the methane out, or we want to get the organic material out of the landfill so that we are creating less methane and we can hit that 40% target that 1383 provides. So how do we do that when it comes to organic waste recovery? Well, 1383 in the methane organic waste world has three main targets. The first one is to reduce the amount of organic material that goes to the landfill by 50% by 2020, this year. And the baseline that we're using for these targets for the first two are 2014. So we've got that. So we don't know yet. We're in 2020. CalRecycle is trying to figure out where we are in terms of, well, we've got about what? The rest of this month. We've got 30 more days to figure out whether or not we're going to meet that target. It'll probably take CalRecycle a long time to actually tell us where we are. The second target is a 75% reduction in the amount of organic waste that we send to the landfill by 2025. And then there is one more component of 1383, which is to capture 20% of the edible food that would otherwise go to the landfill. You know, we are a country that is notorious for wasting food. The estimates are quite high. I think I've seen even like 40% of the food that we create ends up in the landfill, and yet people are still hungry. And so for the first time, actually in the United States, this state law is trying to regulate edible food recovery. And so it's a big kind of game changer in our world, you know, the solid waste industry world. We're not really used to this, but because it's tied to us trying to get all of that food out of the landfill, and there are people who actually need it, there is this 20% edible food recovery component, which is really great. Let me just say one on the timeline. The regs were just adopted last month. It was I think they had 3 or 4 drafts of the regulations. Again, 127 pages, lots and lots and lots of requirements. They become effective on 2022. And then in 2024 is when cities and counties will be required to start penalizing people who are not doing the right thing. And it's very prescriptive. So the requirements are far-reaching. This is just a very high-level look at the different types of requirements there are, but there are certain types of collection systems that have to be put in place. For instance, when we talked about those collection systems, the 2 container and the 5 container at Sunnyvale, those are generally okay, but you'd have a 1 container or a 5 container, you have to make sure that they abide by very prescriptive regulations that are in the regs. There's a lot of education and outreach, there's a lot of reporting, and I mentioned the food recovery component, which will require some large generators like restaurants, grocery stores. If you fall into certain categories of being what they call commercial edible food generator, you will have to contract with a food recovery organization or a food recovery service that will take your surplus food and give it to people who need it. And all of this will, the city and the county will have to be tracking all of this. So that is SB 1383. I know that was a lot. And lastly, I kind of want to wrap up with the big picture. I love this photo. It was taken by Dan Gottlieb, an environmentalist photographer in Los Angeles. It shows Antarctica in 2010, and I keep it nearby. I actually have it here. Because I like to keep the big picture in mind. I think that climate change is the biggest issue of our time. And so, sometimes when we are in the weeds in my work, I was in a 4-hour negotiation meeting this morning, making sure that all of these requirements are being fulfilled and that the city is covered. But I like to just keep this big picture in mind, because even 1383 references AB 932, AB 32, which is California's Global Warming Solutions Act. So, this is what it all comes down to. And that picture of Antarctica also, it comes at a time where Antarctica just saw earlier this year the hottest temperature on record. And so, and that photo was actually taken, 10 years ago. So now it's even much worse. So I like to keep that big picture in mind. Sometimes this work can seem a little in the weeds, but we have to get into the weeds because, we're all in this together. So with that, I am happy to take any questions that might come up.
Thank you very much, Monaliza.
Yeah.
That was great. I think that it was a super relevant talk, especially for what's going on in today's world. So thank you for shedding some light on it. And I think that there are some lessons buried in there about what people can do at home to prepare for this. So I wanted to kick off there and ask you a couple questions. So when we put out the waste management curriculum, we also included a composting component to help people learn what to do with their food waste from home. Mm-hmm. Is that one of the ways that people can start to keep food out of the landfill on their own?
Yeah, definitely. Community composting and in just doing kind of self-management. And SB 1383 actually has some provisions for if you're a generator, and you have your organic materials, but you've got a pit in the back, you've got your composting warm pit, and you want to just take care of it yourself, you can do that. And then, the city or county, when they're doing their mandatory enforcement ordinances, they will have to decide, it's at their discretion of whether or not they would want to allow, for instance, community composting. It gets a little tricky in just, in my world of contract management and compliance, and what the haulers, like a waste management or ecology, will say. For them, it's really thinking about it through the business deal, even though it might not seem like a lot. But if a lot of people are allowed to just throw their organics in their back, if a substantial amount of people were able to do that, then that might infringe upon their revenue and their business model, right? If they're not subscribing. So we're always thinking like that hauler side of like the business model side of things. But in terms of a regulatory side and what you can do at home, you could do that if your city allowed it, definitely.
I see. And I'm hearing you say the city. So I wonder, you talked about 2 different cities, for example, now that have different collection systems. Will it be up to the cities once these regulations are adopted to figure out what collection systems work for them?
Yes, exactly. And so that's something that we will help them with if they already have a program in place. I mean, a lot of cities, especially in the Bay Area, are quite progressive. They already are collecting their organics already. And they think, oh, well, we already have an organics collection program. We don't need to do much else. But the regulations are so far reaching. And it's not only about your collection system type. And I'll give you one quick example. But for instance, so the city can determine what makes sense for them. If they have a 3-container collection program and it's working for them and it's compliant, that's great. Maybe they want to think about a 2-container program, though. Maybe they don't have a commercial organic waste and they want to think about 2-container. The regulations are very specific in terms of if you have, based off of the type of collection system you have, it will kind of tug on other requirements, mainly processing requirements. So for instance, like that San Jose, that 2-container system where they had their organics in one chunk and they had their recyclables in the other chunk, they would have to make sure that the processing facility that's taking that dry bin would meet certain performance standards. So it's just like there are a bunch of different factors. And of course, it comes down to many times with cities, especially now with COVID impacts and revenue impacts. And this is sometimes called an unfunded mandate, that people have to pay for this and they want to do it in the most cost-effective way, which is reasonable, because at the end of the day, you and I will be paying for these rate increases. But it's up to the cities, to decide how they want to do it. And some cities will take on the costs. We've got cities that want to do they don't want to offer, there are some waivers, they don't want to offer the waivers. They say, no, everyone's going to do it. This is a policy decision. We don't care if it's going to cost a little bit more, but we want to have these programs and these services. And so that's where, the city discretion does come into place.
So there's some interesting things to think about actually enacting these regulations.
Yeah, definitely.
We've got a couple audience questions here, but I just wanted to ask a quick follow-up before we get to those. We talked a little bit about composting. In getting ready for these regulations to be adopted, what are some other things people might be able to start to shift on their own at home so they're prepared?
Yeah. I think just getting into the habit of it, finding the best solution that works for you. And it's difficult. We always talk about participation and how to get people involved. And, a sticking point, especially with organics, is the ick factor. People are like, oh, it's smelly, it's gross, so kind of coming up with individual methods that work for you. Some people put their organics in a freezer, kind of like keeps it away. Some people will use paper bags, but finding out what works best now, or maybe doing a pit if you have room for it, Yeah.
Great. So we'll take a couple audience questions here. Both of these are kind of related to the train of recycling and reusing. So Spencer's asking, are there people working on regulations or programs related to compostable products to make items that are compostable, or to figure out what counts as an organic or compostable product?
Yeah, that's such an interesting question. And it's a great question. And I was actually kind of going there in my head, just because I was also just in this negotiation meeting this morning, and compostable plastics is a big sticking point for for cities and haulers and participation. I mean, I think we generally know that when you can give a compostable plastic bag and say put your organics in there, or a plastic bag, more people might be willing to do it because it kind of takes away a little bit of that ick factor. 1383, the regulations allow for compostable plastics. However, they have to be able, the hauler has to be able to provide notice to the city that they are able to process and recover that material. Now, that compostable plastics being recovered is a big sticking point right now in the regulations, because a lot of composters and processors don't think they can actually recover it. They might be able to accept the compostable plastics, but they'll probably have to take them out to get that OMRI certified organic compost product that they want. So I think that we're going to get more clarification from CalRecycle right now. Everyone is kind of like, the regulations were just finalized, and now CalRecycle soon in the next coming weeks will put out their frequently asked questions, like responses. They got something like 1,300 comments during the regulatory process, and they have to respond to all of them. And so compostable plastics will be definitely a big topic area where we'll get some more insight. So they're allowed, but it's a big sticking point at the end of the day. And from what I've heard personally from composters is that they haven't seen a compostable plastic that really does break down, is the word on the street, is from what I've heard. Mm-hmm. But cities want greater participation, and to do that, they want to allow compostable plastics in their programs. So it's,
right. Maybe some kinks to be worked out, sounds like.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Our next question from Laura here kind of relates to the supply chain created by waste management and what goes into the landfill. So when we take items out and try to recycle them, why are these recycled materials so expensive?
Yeah. I think it comes down to, as many business decisions do, the bottom line, and the natural gas production and oil and virgin materials are just cheaper than a recycled material plastic that you're going to get. So at the end of the day, if it's going to cost me double, I mean, it might be good for my brand if I can say that I'm using post-consumer recyclable materials. But a lot of times these are business points that are being made. And so if your virgin material is cheaper than a recycled content material, then I'm going to go with the cheaper one as a business person. However, 1383 does stipulate certain kind of recycled content. I think for paper it stipulates that, but that's why there is a big push in kind of the natural kind of resource conservation movement to get manufacturers to, or get legislation that says your products have to have a minimum 20% recycled content, because without those policies, businesses are just going to want to make as much money as they can make. And if using virgin materials gets them there, then likely that's what they're going to do.
Mm-hmm. Right. Another complex situation that hopefully we'll see some refinement in the coming years.
Yeah.
Let's do one more question here from Laura. Let's see. How do you deal with cities or hauling services that don't really want to make these changes to their waste management systems? I know you talked about a year of implementation and then a couple years later, the compliance.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk about that?
Sure. Yeah. Well, that's why, the spectrum of compliance is wide. You can have, cities that want to do the bare minimum. They just want to check the box and say, hey, the state is making us do this, and we're going to do it because the state is making us do it, but we're going to not do it fully, or, but at the end of the day, they're going to have to, because these CalRecycle compliance orders that can come down, now that they can take years to come down. A city can be put on a corrective action notice, for instance, if they don't have the right programs in place in the first few years of implementation. But if they don't get their act together, and if they don't, comply with their order, they can face fines up to $10,000 a day, and that could maybe be even retroactive. So I think cities realize that they do have to comply. CalRecycle is being, the first phase of implementation. They're really stressing education. So if you have a non-compliant generator, the city is required to give them education on what they're supposed to do and how they're supposed to properly source separate. So they've built in that 2 years, we're going to educate people. But after that 2 years, if your hauler is taking your material to an unpermitted facility, or to a facility that's not designated to handle organic waste, then the city can put a fine on the hauler, because the city is at risk of getting a fine from CalRecycle.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, I'm glad to hear that those regulations are in place.
Yeah.
So I want to move a little bit more into kind of the broad spectrum of your career. I thought it was fascinating that you came from kind of a multidisciplinary background. And then in the beginning of your talk, you said, well, I used my journalism background to find some of this background research for this project. Can you talk a little bit for our students watching about how you've taken all of these cool things that you studied and melded them together into one career?
Yeah, well, I think that, broadly, I think we kind of never know where we're going to go sometimes. Like, we're constantly growing and changing, and our interests are, I think, constantly changing. And so, but I know it's kind of like my background has definitely informed where I'm going and where I want to go, and it's helped me. I think my journalism background has helped me be able to communicate effectively, which sometimes, like in the sciences, is really hard for people to communicate. We've got to do a lot of communicating with the public, with city councils. At the end of the day, we've got to explain this to people in a way that makes sense to them, because sometimes we get so much into our solid waste world. But, it's just, I think, what drove me to the environmental sector, and it sprung board from my journalism work, was that I was just always interested in environmental stories. And so but I always felt like I was scratching the surface of them. And so that's why I just wanted to learn more. And then I did. And then I ended up shifting into a career, making it a career move. So, but it's all relevant. I think it's like Steve Jobs said this thing about him taking a cartography class way back when, but that really helped him be able to bring fonts to Apple. And it's like, he would have never thought of that connection being there. But everything you do, no matter the job, I think will build your skill set.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing. Super relevant topic. It totally rounds out our understanding of waste management, from composting to wastewater last week to a little bit more about solid waste. And I'm sure that we'll all think of you as these regulations come and impact us at home here in California.
Yes.
Well, thank you so much. Monaliza, I'm going to pull you out real quick and just remind our donors. Thank you. Remind everyone that it is Giving Tuesday. We are able to provide programs like this to expose students to working professional scientists absolutely for free through your help. So we need your help to continue offering these programs, to bring real working scientists into classrooms and into homes all over the country, so that students can understand what kind of research and careers are possible for them. So there's a phone number here, and there's a link to donate. Thank you so much for watching, and we will see you next week.